Welcome to the Dakota County Library virtual program. My name is Marcellus Davis, and today we'll be learning about the history of Juneteenth. This virtual program is dedicated to the enslaved ancestors who came to the shores of America in 1619 unwillingly, but made this country what it is today. And we are going to recognize their contributions to this country today and forevermore through the celebration known as Juneteenth. Once known as Jubilee Day, the first Jubilee Day took place 1 year after slavery ended in Galveston, Texas in 1865, per the General Order Number 3 by General Gordon Granger. It was 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation by President Lincoln, in which it took 2 additional years for Texas to adhere to the Emancipation Proclamation. Many believe that it was because Texas did not want to adhere to the ending of slavery. They wanted to get more profit through crops and harvesting. And they just didn't particularly care for the President Lincoln at the time. So this made the Emancipation Proclamation and decided to do their own thing as it relates to slavery. Again, Jubilee Day was 1 year after 1865 and 1866. In some of the Jubilee early gatherings, the Emancipation Proclamation was read during the gatherings. In some of the early gatherings in Jubilee, there were barbecues, there were horse riding, there were hymns and songs and prayers sang. There was a general transmission of culture and a real jovial and festive spirit about Africans who have now gained their freedom in the country of America and were planning to start to live out the ideals written and expressed in the Constitution. Now, as you could imagine, a state, Texas, that did not want to adhere to the orders of the Emancipation Proclamation had issues with free African Americans celebrating their freedom. So there were a lot of terroristic threats, there were a lot of terroristic activities, killing of people, hanging, lynching of free Africans because they had found their freedom and they were celebrating about their new life with the ending of the institution of slavery. The late 1890s, mid 1890s, the terminology Jubilee changed to Juneteenth. And what does Juneteenth? Well, the ending of slavery happened on June 19th, 1865. So it is a combination of June 19th, thus we call it Juneteenth. As June 19th has been around for over 100 years, the expansion of Juneteenth present day has kept some of the traditional values of the celebration of the ending of slavery by singing, by prayer, by the transmission of culture, drum, dancing, all that spiritual essence that comes with African people is still present today. At the core of Juneteenth is not only the celebration of free, liberated Africans and the ending of institutional slavery. The resilience of African people is highly on display, as well as one of the core elements of Juneteenth, the black family, is going to be present as well. So you're going to even have people there talking about, you're going to have African psychologists, you're going to have people there who are really talking about the staple of black community, black unity, and black love and black liberation that will be present at Juneteenth. This is an expression of liberation of black people. This is an expression of love for being black. This is an expression of unity, this thing we call Juneteenth. At the same time, it is paying homage to our ancestors who put forth their lives for Juneteenth to be present in 2020 and 2021 going forth. Juneteenth's expansion has almost hit all 50 plus states, so it is a beautiful thing that is still present today. Frederick Douglass, one of the greatest Americans who ever served this country in a way that pushed and agitated the country to do the right thing. Frederick Douglass was one of the greatest abolitionists who often advocated for the ending of slavery as well as rallying people for the ending of slavery. Frederick Douglass was a man who had the ear of the president and often used his platform to push the president of the time, to do the right thing, the administrative cabinet to do the right thing. Frederick Douglass was a free man who fought his way out of slavery into the White House to be able to be a constant street storyteller of what was really happening in communities and what slaves were really feeling, enslaved people were really feeling, to tell the stories and the narratives of enslaved people so that the institution of slavery would end. Constant critiquer of this country, constant agitator for truth, and constant agitator for justice. He is a transcendent figure that is not only was relevant then, but is relevant in 2020 as we are still fighting for Black Lives to Matter in this country. He was fighting for it in the early 1800s, one of the most photographed men in this country has ever seen, went around the country advocating for the ending of institutional slavery. Frederick Douglass's spirit is still alive today like it was in the early 1900s, as Black people are still fighting for some of the measures of success in this country, whether it's police brutality, whether it's equitable and equal education, whether it's justice in the judicial system, whether it's housing, whether it's health care, proper health care. That spirit that Frederick Douglass evoked then is still present in many scholarists, activists, everyday Black folks who are fighting for Black Lives to Matter in 2020 as he fought in the early 1900s. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity, your sound of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciation of tyrants' brass-fronted impotence, your shout of liberty and equality, hollow mockery, your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impity, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of the United States at this very hour. In this speech given July 5th, 1852 by Frederick Douglass, Douglass critically critiqued America's claim that this July 4th celebration was an independence for all Americans. In this speech, he critiqued a country in which he loved so much about how all Americans do not see this July 4th Independence Day as a day of independence for all. In particular, he critiqued America that the enslaved Africans making profit for the institution of slavery could not justify, could not believe, could not accept that this was an Independence Day for all. It is important to understand some of the terrorism that was applied on black people during enslavement. So you have to understand that one of the prime acts of institutional slavery was to rip the male from the family, to take a male who oftentimes was considered a buck and have him breed with other women that may not be his wife. It was important to note that women had to bear children to help create additional revenue for slave owners. And they were seen as this property that could produce new life, that would create new revenue for plantations. It is important to note that black women were respected to take care of white children to a different degree than they took care of their own children. It is important to know that two children, black and white, could grow up knowing that at some point the white child would be an owner of the black child. So the conditions of slavery were vile. They were oppressive. There is empirical evidence that slaves worked themselves to death and could die in the fields. Children were grown up in cotton fields, knowing that in 20 to 30 years, this would be their plight. So hope was always something one could wrestle with. Yet and still, African people were resilient enough to use hope to fight back as a resistance, to find hope in their mental existence, to find hope in their children ending the institution of slavery. For much of America's existence, slavery has been part of the history of America. And it is important to know black liberation is still being sought out by African Americans. The ending of slavery technically has been less than 150 years on the books. But Jim Crow, black codes, have been all enacted to reinforce a new type of slavery. And we also have mass incarceration with the 13th Amendment. So slavery has been morphed into different forms, still oppressing black people, but technically slavery has ended. Black liberation is still being sought for in the spirit of Frederick Douglass. And that hope eventually led to the ending of slavery June 19, 1865, and led to the celebration we know as Jubilee Day in 1866. Hope got Africans through the institution of slavery. Hope is still present in the African American community that is striving for black liberation and striving for love back from the American country. 11 years after the July 5th, 1852 Frederick Douglass speech comes Emancipation Proclamation by President Lincoln. And it is important to know that this did not come out of the morality and heart and mind of President Lincoln. President Lincoln was quoted multiple times denigrating the enslaved African. President Lincoln felt that this would save the Union, aka saving America. It is important to note that this was not done out of morality. Nevertheless, this, being the Emancipation Proclamation freeing the slaves, was done. So as you can see, the Emancipation Proclamation technically freed the slaves, but it is important to note that not all states adhere to this proclamation. It is important to note that Texas did not respond to this proclamation almost 2.5 years later, from 1863 to 1865. Some states adhered to the Emancipation Proclamation. Some states did not adhere to the Emancipation Proclamation for various reasons. Some just did not want to abide by President Lincoln's uh, uh, direction. Some wanted to continue gaining profit from the institution of enslavement. Some just wanted to do their own thing. And it is important to note that the ending of slavery did not happen until 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. And this leads us into the celebration known as Jubilee, which commemorates, affirms the liberation of African people through the ending of enslavement in this country. It is important to recognize that free African Americans celebrate Jubilee Day, which was the celebration of the ending of enslavement and the institution of slavery in America. And it is important to note that that practice has continued today. And by the 1890s, there was a metamorphosis in the name. There was a change in the name, which led from Jubilee Day to Juneteenth, meaning June 19th, which was June 19th, 1865, was the ending of slavery in Texas, in Galveston, Texas. It is important to note that in the mid 1900s, let's say 1920 to about the late 1960s, there was a lull in the celebration of Juneteenth around the country. After the assassination, April 4th, 1968, of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who was at the time gearing up for the Poor People's Campaign, his right-hand person, Reverend Abernathy, and his wife, Dr. Coretta Scott King, continued the Poor People's Campaign, and it did not meet the heights in which it was supposed to meet. And there was a decision made to end the Poor People's Campaign. And the organizers and the leaders of the Poor People's Campaign were very astute to history. And they chose June 19th, 1968 to end the Poor People's Campaign. This was almost 100 years from the first recognition of the ending of the institution of enslavement and Jubilee Day, June 19th, 1968. And many of the people that were part of the Poor People's Campaign took that energy and they brought it back to their communities, and there was a resurgence of Juneteenth that spread into multiple different cities, Minneapolis, Milwaukee being some of note. And due to that, by 1979, there were about 47 states that recognized and adopted Juneteenth as a holiday in this nation. It is important to note that in 1996, Minnesota adopted Juneteenth as a recognized holiday. It is also important to note that Minnesota is revered around the country as one of the staples of celebrating Juneteenth. Not only celebrating through cultural aesthetics, but also celebrating by information and community building. It is very important to note that even prior to the adoption of Juneteenth, Minnesota had been practicing and celebrating and paying homage to enslaved ancestors for years prior to the adoption of Minnesota recognizing Juneteenth as a holiday. Future implications for Juneteenth, the advocacy should be around deeper contextualizing and understanding the origins of Juneteenth in public education as well as higher education. Future implications around Juneteenth should also focus on federally recognizing Juneteenth as a national holiday in which people have the opportunity to observe and pay homage to those who helped create this nation in its institution and structure of building this country to what it is as it relates to wealth, as it relates to infrastructure and building of the country. Future implications talk about how the black family will be a core element of Juneteenth and how black families will utilize this as a generational transferring of knowledge and paying homage to and moving towards black liberation. Future implications of Juneteenth as it relates to the black family is to continue to exhibit black unity, black love, black liberation, and the transferring of intergenerational knowledge of what it means to be black and continually to define what it means to be black, in particular being black in America. Future implications as it relates to the nation is that it is important for this country to understand that the ending of slavery and the institution of enslavement is American history through the African American experience. It is important for Americans to recognize that Juneteenth is a marker of history in American history that all benefit from. It tells the story of some of the most heinous, unjust actions that this country has ever taken towards oppression of black people. This is an opportunity that should be given through textbooks. This is an opportunity for those that decide to visit their local Juneteenth. This is an opportunity to continue your knowledge building as it relates to Juneteenth and the history of African Americans. As we sign off, I want to thank the Dakota County Library and MELSA for providing the platform for me to come to you through this virtual program experience. I want to thank you, the viewers, for taking your time out to learn a little bit more about Juneteenth. My name is Marcellus Davis, and I have a critical question and an action-oriented question for you. As we go forth after June 19, 2020, what is it that you will do to continue learning about Juneteenth? What is it that you will do to assure that in the community, the teachings of Juneteenth will not only be told in the classrooms of Public 12, will be shared in the community centers, the community libraries, so that all Americans can benefit from this great history of Juneteenth.